going live. All right, so in order, part of the way to get water into the pump and out of the pump effectively is through various different tools and implements called adapters and appliances. So we have several different adapters and appliances. We're not going to go over all of them, but some of the main ones are your gated Y, which is shaped like a Y with two gates on it that you can control externally. You've got a Siamese, so we know a Y reduces, a Siamese increases. So Y is bigger to smaller, Siamese is smaller to bigger. And I guess the thing you probably need to know about that is that when you put something through a Y, you're increasing friction loss, and when you put something through a Siamese, you're decreasing friction loss, but you're also limiting your flow. So we'll get into a little bit of that in a few minutes, and then hydrant valve is another accessory that we use, or appliance that we use a lot. A lot of departments, when they hook up to a hydrant, they'll always put a hydrant valve on the 2.5, just so they have another outlet, just in case something goes wrong with the steamer. There's tons and tons of different adapters and appliances. You know, there's water thieves, and there's various different kinds of hydrant valves, and there's ungated Ys, and there's gated Siameses, and there's hose clamps and hose jackets, and all different kinds of appliances, and all stuff that you need to know if you're operating a pump. We've got couplers. This would be now here's a good question. Would you call this a female to female or a male to male? I call it a double female. But if I was calling it something to something, it should be a male to male, right? Because you take a male end of a hose and connect it to another male end of a hose. It's kind of confusing. Double female is what I call it. We call that one double male, or female to female. What about this one?
It looks like a reducer.
It's a reducer. It looks like 1 3/4 to 1 inch or something like that. This one?
Steamer distorts.
Steamer.
Threaded distorts.
Yeah, I call it a steamer distorts, just like you said. This looks to be a probably 5-inch steamer distorts.
2.5 distorts.
Yeah, so we could call that. I've heard people call that an increaser, but I've never used the term. But yeah, it's 2.5 distorts, and that would be 2.5 female distorts. Distorts is sexless, so we don't have to worry about male or female. So it's more politically correct and up to today's society. So if we can get to distorts, we should do that. It makes things easier. 4 to 5 stores. Another reducer, 2.5 to 1 3/4, and then another. Yeah, so 2.5 male to 4-inch stores. Could go on and on and on. We could do pages of these, right? Yeah. The point is, there's always a way to make the connection, and for the most part, we have a way on the truck somehow to get this hose to connect to this pump, or this hose to connect to this hose, or this hose to connect to this appliance. You gotta know what these things do, and know that we have the equipment there to do it. All right, your PTO controller, pretty standard in most fire trucks. It's gonna look like something like that. When I started out, before I became a career fireman, I was already a volunteer, but I was a dump truck driver, and so these were in all the dump trucks, what you use to make your bed go up. Most of the time, anytime you're using a power takeoff, where something takes power from the engine to run another component of a vehicle, that's what you use. It's going to be something similar to that. All right, so those are just some different things that you need to know about in order to run the pump, and we'll get more into that a little later. All right, so now we move into types of water sources. We're going to talk about 3 main types of water sources in this class. The booster tank is the first one. Sometimes we don't think about that as a water source, but it is. It's 1,000 gallons of water, and it's a water source, and we have to open a valve to get water from the tank to the pump, just like we'd have to open any other intake valve. So think of your tank to pump as an intake valve. So types of water, so your booster tank, engine 71 and pumper 71, both carry 1,000 gallons of water on board in the booster tank. And there you can see Lance getting ready to pump. I was gonna say off the booster tank, but I see the supply line right there, so it's the picture's a sham. Alright, so pressurized water sources. Give me some pressurized water sources. There's one. That's a fire hydrant. Relay. Tanker. Anything else?
Your water systems on, like your fire suppression systems will have the water on sea.
Yeah.
I can't think of the name of it.
So like outboard tanks or whatever. Those are the only three I put on there though. You guys were right on it. Hydrant, relay, tanker. Even if we're just nursing a tanker through a 2.5 inch line, it's still a pressurized source because we're using a pump to pump water into our pump. Static and natural, or static, or that should just say static. No, it says static because there's two different types of static sources. There's natural and man-made. Okay, so what are some natural sources? Pond, river or stream, lake.
Man-made.
Swimming pool's not natural. Swimming pool's not natural. How about man-made? Swimming pools, storage tanks, porta tanks. You've got cisterns. You've got above ground water storage that they're basically like man-made ponds, but they're not really ponds, they're just water storage. There's several different kinds of man-made water sources, static water sources. And now, if you're taking water from the bottom of a water tower, is that a static water source?
Technically.
Well, it depends if it's pumped or gravity fed.
It's not pumped, it's
They're all
just gravity fed.
gravity fed.
Technically, it is a static source, but it is going to be pressurized because of head pressure, right? So it's kind of a gray area, and that's just for fun. We're not going to talk about that anymore. All right, so now we're into operating the fire pump. When we're operating the fire pump, obviously the first thing that we're keeping in mind, as anything that we do on any fire scene ever, is safety. Okay, so we're going to follow the incident command system. We're going to, even in training, we have an incident command system. Always be aware of your surroundings. Always chalk the wheels. I say wear PPE. I put turnout. I don't really care if you wear turnout pants. If you don't mind your pants getting wet, then that's fine. But nowadays, there's a balance somewhere between how much we should be putting our turnout gear on and how much we shouldn't because of cancer and other things that we know about. So for pumping, I'll just say here, I don't care if you wear bunker pants or not, but I would like to see you wear gloves anytime you're handling hose. I would like to see you wear a helmet anytime we're working with pressurized water, which is anytime we're using a fire pump, and probably be a good idea to wear some sort of eye protection. But be aware of your surroundings is really important. You guys have probably all seen the videos of the guy turning on the hydrant and the end of the hydrant busts out and it takes his knees out. I mean, people break legs and limbs all the time because of bad fire hydrants or because a hose comes unhooked from a truck. You saw some of those videos we watched earlier of loose hose lines. Water under pressure is dangerous. So always be aware of your surroundings. Don't ever straddle a hose if you can avoid it. Stuff like that. Don't step on hoses, things like that. Just be careful. Also, you've got all this spaghetti laid on the ground, and every one of those is an ankle roller. So just be aware of that. That's why we wear boots in the fire service that go above our ankles and not tennis shoes. I know sometimes some of us do wear tennis shoes, but just be aware, like that's a boot does offer ankle support. Alright, so moving on to the operation. So placing the pump in gear. First thing is we're going to make sure the truck is in neutral to begin with. The reason I put that there is because I have seen, and I've probably done, pull up to a scene, set the parking brake, get out, do whatever, blah, 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 get back in the truck, guess what? I forgot to put it in neutral. Thank God for good parking brakes. That does happen from time to time. If you try to put the pump in gear and the truck's not in neutral, it's gonna let you know. Yeah, it's gonna make a lot of noise. And that PTO gear is not gonna be happy. So make sure your truck's in neutral, make sure your parking brake is set. And the order you're gonna do this in is put your truck in neutral, set your parking brake. While you're in the cab, move your PTO switch from road to pump. This is actually our truck's PTO switch, so see how it's in road? See how it says pump? None of these lights are on. That means it's pump's not engaged. When you put the PTO controller in a pump, this light that says pump engaged is going to come on, and this light on the dash that says pump engaged is also going to come on. You're going to have two lights that say pump engaged. Are you ready to pump? No. When you put the transmission in drive, then the power takeoff can actually start taking power from the motor, and then this light will come on, okay to pump, and this light, okay to pump. You got two different indications. A lot of trucks will have the same on the pump panel. I don't believe ours does. Or actually, the pump controller says okay to pump on it, I think. So if you don't hear the pump going, you should be able to hear it activate. You can hear it, but like if all else fails, if you don't have pump engaged and okay to pump in at least two different places, you have not gotten the pump turned on fully. So just know that. And then, like I said, we're not talking a bunch about shutting down, but when we shut down, just do this in reverse. If you don't take the truck out of drive and put it into neutral before you disengage the pump, it will grind and make a lot of noise. Alright, so next thing we're going to do is, assuming we're operating off of the booster tank, we're moving on. So those steps are the same no matter how we're pumping. These steps we just talked about. Now we're talking about pumping off a booster tank.
Real quick, before we move on. So, it's a different gear set when you hit drive. So when you're driving down the road, you're in mode 5.
Yeah,
And when you hit drive and pump, you're in mode 4.
that's correct.
So, the old truck, 73, 71, whatever it is, sometimes it misaligns itself and you go back into gear mode, or the road mode.
Really?
And so, like, I've started hitting it in drive and waiting for the 4, and then for the 4 to come up on the side of it and hearing the connection.
Mm-hmm.
Because 10 or 15 times now, I've gotten out in pump mode, come out, and I'm not spinning, and I go back in, and I'm just flashing 5.
So, does it give you an okay to pump, or does
I
it just say
have-
pump engaged?
I have all of the light on,
It'll give you
and
the
I
lights.
go down to road, hit drive, and it's like, if you sequence it too quick, or don't give it enough care,
Mm-hmm.
you'll skip back into road gear instead of pump gear.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought that up, because something I didn't mention that I should have is, and I'm not saying this is causing that, but since you brought that up, it reminded me I was going to talk about this. When you switch this PTO valve, it's a pneumatic valve. It takes a little bit of time for the air to make the switch. So I always, you see this slot right here in the middle? Move it from here to here and let it go, then wait for the air to stop and then move it the rest of the way, every time. That'll help.
Because that's what I did.
Generally speaking, and like I said, I'm not saying that that's why your truck was doing it, but the other thing is, and I don't know, like that's an issue we should probably address on that truck. But you're right, it does have to be in mode 4, not mode 5. So that's a good troubleshooting thing, and that's also, I'm surprised that both lights come on when it does that.
Yeah,
I think
I'll
it's-
go.
I think it just.
I believe you,
The full go ahead.
because usually the second light doesn't come on until the pump is actually spinning.
And it's only when I'm in a hurry
Yeah,
is when it happens.
okay.
Or
So it's
the
like,
battery.
you know. Alright,
So
well,
most of the time?
so we can only depend on electronics so much, right? So a good pump operator is going to hear the pump engage and know that it's spinning. But this is a good segue into the next step. When you get out of the cab of the truck, the very first thing you should do is chalk the wheels. Because that exact scenario, if you're in mode 5 for some reason and that computer wasn't smart enough to put it in the right mode, there's a good chance that your rear end and your wheels are activated, that your power takeoff did not work, and so now my truck is actually in drive. My parking brake's set, but if something should go wrong with my parking brake, that truck is going to go somewhere. And if for some reason, which with a computerized pump controller, I doubt you could, but if you had a manual throttle and you could throttle it up, that could be a big problem. Your truck could take off. So steps. These steps are important. Put the truck in neutral, set the parking brake. Engage the pump by moving the PTO switch. Get out, chalk the wheels. I should have put a slide on there that showed you how to chalk the wheels. I didn't, but that's a step in the process. Get out, chalk the wheels. If you're pumping, now we're moving on. So every time, those are the things you do. You put the truck in neutral, set the parking brake, move the pump controller to pump, put the truck in drive. In engine 71's case, make sure it's drive mode 4, not drive mode 5. Get out, put your wheel chocks out before you do anything at the pump panel. Then we can move on. Booster tank. We're going to open the tank to pump valve right here to take water from the booster tank into the pump. Our water source is the booster tank. So consider that your intake valve. Because it is an intake valve. You're taking water in from the booster tank into the pump. Okay? So open the tank to pump valve all the way. There is never a reason ever to not open the tank to pump valve all the way. I can't think of one. But I've seen people do it. Because they get the tank to pump and the tank fill valve mixed up in their head. That's why I keep harping on this so much. Tank to pump means water from the pump, from the tank to the pump. Tank fill means water from the pump to the tank.
Maybe we should call it pump to tank.
And I've heard people call it that before. Just to alleviate confusion. Maybe it should be called pump to tank.
Fired up.
Yeah. But again, if you don't have an external water source and you open your pump to tank valve, you will cavitate the pump. So something to keep in mind, unless your tank to pump valve is open. If your tank to pump valve's open and your pump to tank valve's open, you're good. If you don't open your tank to pump valve and you just open your pump to tank valve, something's going to go right. All right. So, okay. So we've opened our tank to pump valve. We open that by pulling it out all the way. If we're pumping off the booster tank, I really can't think of a scenario where you should be pumping RPM. You should probably just be pumping PSI, unless you're about to switch to an external source. Now, these are not black and white issues here. These are really pump controller choice or pump operator choice. But I would say this, when I'm pumping, if I'm drafting, I'm pumping in RPM mode. I never draft from PSI mode. It's too unreliable. There's too many ways for the pump to take over and for me to lose draft. I want to be, if I'm pumping in relay mode, if I'm relay pumping, I pump in RPM mode. Because again, I want to set a set RPM, and because when you're pumping in relay, we're getting into, this is not part of the class, we're going to move on. Just for this class, when you're pumping from the booster tank, put it in PSI mode, okay?
It defaults to PSI.
Yeah, it does default to PSI. All right. Slowly open the desired discharge. Let's say you're pumping to pre-connect 1. You slowly open that discharge prior to increasing the throttle. When you open that, you're going to have a pressure with your pump just spinning at idle. It's probably going to be
35, 40.
35 to 50 would be my guess, depending on the size of your pump and all that stuff. Increase the throttle to achieve desired pressure. Turn the throttle wheel clockwise to increase pressure, counterclockwise to decrease throttle. Okay? I put a little arrow there to show you. So that's how you increase, and none of these numbers don't mean anything right now. Your discharge pressure here is 20, and you have, because there's no external water source, your intake pressure is negative 20, but that, right now, that doesn't matter. So, all right, so then after that, you continuously monitor your discharge pressure or pressures. Your PSI controller will monitor what? If you're in PSI mode, what is it monitoring?
Pressure.
It's monitoring your master discharge, right? So the guy that was showing the pump parts and all that, as it comes out of the volute to the discharge flange, that gauge is probably somewhere in that area. It's the amount of discharge pressure that's coming out of your entire pump. So it doesn't have anything to do with your individual discharge. Your individual discharges. Pressures can fluctuate with opening and closing of nozzles. The pump controller should adapt to these pressure changes. In RPM mode, the pump controller will not adapt to pressure changes. It's at a set RPM. It's like the old fashioned. I'll add this real quick. When you're at the pump, when you get all your pressure set, if you set your pressure and the nozzle's laying in the yard and then your crew goes inside and they open the nozzle, what's going to happen?
Pressure drop.
The pressure's going to drop, and if you're in PSI mode, the pump's going to go wah, and it's going to catch it. So that's the good thing about PSI mode. I can set my discharge pressure at 130. If I've got a line coming off, it's going to have that line the nozzle pressure is going to be less, but it's going to have that discharge at 130. Depends on which nozzle you got on there.
How long is
200.
I said you're gonna lose like 100 PSI? That's not,
You can.
that's not high.
It depends on how much you're trying to flow, though. So we'll get into that later.
Okay.
But just know that when people are opening and closing nozzles, your pressures are going to differentiate. What I see with new drivers is, and then the nozzle opens and the pressure goes in there, you turning the throttle and pushing buttons and just give it a minute. Let things regulate. If you're in PSI mode and you only have one line going off that truck, you've done everything you need to do. Really. Now, as you add lines, you may have to gate things down and stuff like that. But again, remember, when somebody opens a nozzle, the truck's going to respond to that. And if you make adjustments every single time somebody opens a nozzle, you will never know what your pressure is, ever. So just calm down. That's what I would tell new pumper operator. Calm down, let things regulate, and then make your changes. Especially if you're pumping out of RPM mode. Let everything get opened up before you gate everything down, because what's going to happen is if you gate everything down, one nozzle opens and you gate it down, and then this other nozzle opens, and these guys don't have enough pressure. See what I'm saying? So, all right. Continuously monitor your tank volume when you're pumping off the booster tank. Keep in constant communication with the interior crew regarding your tank volume. I always would radio when my tank volume reaches 3/4, 1/2, and 1/4 every time. If I'm at the pump panel, you're down to 3/4. You're down to 1/2. You're down to 1/4. I'm going to shut you down pretty soon. If I don't have a water supply established yet, I need to be thinking about that. Prepare to shut down pumping operations if you don't have a water supply established. Do not ever shut the pump down without letting the interior crew know. If there's two major failures as a pump operator. Number one is cavitating the pump. Number two is shutting a line down or running out of water without the crew knowing. It's okay to run out of water. It's okay to have a line shut down. That happens. But if you do it without letting the crew know, shame on you. Have a radio and talk to the crew. There's no reason not to. Do not continue to pump after the tank is empty. You won't be accomplishing anything other than ruining the pump. And if you're already running out of water and you didn't communicate with the crew, it's not going to do you any good at this point to leave the pump on. You've already failed. Just shut the pump down and let somebody else pump next time. No, I'm just kidding. Just don't do that. Do better next time would be a better solution. All right. Operating the fire pump, adding a pressurized source. So we're pumping from booster tank. We're going to add a pressurized source. We're going to establish a connection to the source. Okay? So we've hooked the hose up to the hydrant. The hydrant's our source. Then to transition, we're going to hook the hose to the proper intake. That's the first step. We're going to use adapters as needed, as we talked about earlier. If you hook this to a discharge, it ain't going to work. It might tear the pump up. I've seen it done. Don't do it. Use adapters as needed. I've also seen people go, you got a whole cabinet full of adapters. Use them. But I've also seen people go from 4-inch stores to like 2.5 threaded back to 4-inch stores because they got themselves confused somehow. Like this. Practice makes perfect. All right. So once you've established your connection, ensure the intake valve is in the closed position. You still haven't turned your hydrant on. Okay. It's in the closed position. This allows the pump operator to control the flow and prevent water hammer. So I don't want this open when the hydrant gets turned on, if I can avoid it, okay? Because I want to be in control of how fast water comes into my pump. So now we can pressurize the line by turning the hydrant on or whatever the external source is. That's a whole different class. We're not even going to talk about hydrants. We're going to open the bleeder, which is right here. That allows the air to escape from the hose and not get into the pump. That's going to be open until all the air is out. And a lot of times I leave it open until my valve's open. And then I close it. Just that way I know all the air is out. Slowly open the valve. Have you noticed a trend here when I'm talking about opening valves? Slowly. And firefighter slow is not as slow as the water company wants it to be, but I'm just asking for you to be firefighter slow. Just a little slower than slamming things open and closed. All right. So keep a close eye on your discharge pressure when you open your valve, because what's going to happen, especially if you're in RPM mode, it's going to go up. If I'm going from booster tank to hydrant, I'm adding pressure into my system. And so if I've got Nate on the end of the line, he's pumping out there at 100 psi nozzle pressure on his one line, and I open the hydrant without paying attention, all of a sudden Nate's going to be like the guy on the video, go flying backwards, and we're going to have problems. So keep that. Now, again, if you're in PSI mode, to a degree, your pump can control that. But if you have a really good hydrant, not that that would be a problem around here, but if you have a really good hydrant, that hydrant could supply enough pressure that even at idle, your pump might be producing more PSI than the hand line is capable, or than a person is capable of handling. So you might need to gauge down discharges. Note your intake pressure. The reason I say that is it's really good to know how much intake pressure I have from the get-go. Because as I add lines and things like that, I'm going to see discharges and I'm going to see changes in intake pressure, and I can use my college algebra training without even having to write stuff down to know, okay, I added 2 lines and I dropped this many PSI. If I add another line, I'm going to drop this much more PSI. Theoretically and estimated based, but it gives you a good idea of how many lines you can keep adding and how much more water. I'm not asking you to know the numbers right now. I'm just saying, in general, know that you have a set PSI coming in when you start, and it goes down as you add more lines. Keep an eye on that. Your intake pressure, when you're pumping from any source, any external source, actually no, drafting is different. If you're pumping from a pressurized source, your intake pressure should never be allowed to dip below 20 PSI, ever.
That's positive 20.
Yes.
Not negative 20.
Right, exactly. Yeah, sorry, this picture is not an accurate, the only reason that arrow's there is to show show this is where you read your intake pressure. I just now noticed that it says -20 there. I didn't even notice
If you
that.
move that arrow over, you can cover that negative and you'll know.
Yeah. Make sure your intake pressure never dips below 20. Then you start cavitating your pump, collapsing lines, all kinds of problems. All right, so now keep a close eye. We already did that slide. All right, so once the intake's fully open, pressures have stabilized. You've determined the intake pressure to be sufficient. Close the tank to pump valve. Another word for intake pressure is residual pressure. Just so you know, they're not exactly the same, but you might hear, like I probably say residual pressure more than I say intake pressure. Just so you know, that's kind of what that means. Close the tank to pump valve. If residual pressure allows, refill the booster tank by opening the tank fill valve. You do not have to open the tank fill valve all the way. The tank fill valve, the line that runs from the pump to the tank, or the pump to tank valve is what we should call it. It's a 3-inch line. So it can flow like 500 GPM. So if I've got a 300 GPM hydrant and I'm flowing 175 GPM on the line, if I open that tank fill valve all the way, what's going to happen?
With water pressure.
I'm going to cavitate my pump. Yeah, I'm not going to have enough water to do it. So just be like, that's another thing I see new pump operators struggle with, is understanding your tank fill valve open all the way. That's a big line and a lot of GPM. Every little bit you crack that tank fill valve is you're stealing GPM from your seam. So I also tell people, if you are flowing water, you do not need to crack your tank fill valve to recirc. In fact, I would say don't. If you are flowing water on a seam, leave that sucker shut unless you're filling your tank. Because you're just robbing pressure, you're robbing GPM from your seam. Okay? When everything gets shut down, you need to recirc water, crack it a little bit. But too many times I see people, that's the first thing they do is get out of the truck, they, crack the tank fill valve because somebody told them you got to keep water recirculating all the time. Well, you can go 5 minutes without recirculating water. And if the goal is to get water out the end of a line, I want as much GPM for that as I can have. So, sorry, I've kicked that horse till it's dead. Or kicked that dead horse, is how that says. All right. If you cannot fill the booster tank without causing the residual pressure to drop below 20, you must wait until one or more of the discharge lines has stopped flowing water. Because at this point, if I'm flowing water, that takes precedence over me refilling my tank. I do want to refill it as soon as I can in case my water source goes away. But if I got people on a line, I'm not going to take water away from them to fill my tank. Does that make sense? All right. Operating a fire pump. These are the same slides you already saw. So now we're from a pressurized source. So we're starting out not with the booster tank, just from a pressurized source. Okay? All the same safety stuff. Place your truck in neutral. Set your parking brake. Switch from road to pump. Wait for your lights to illuminate. Place your transmission in drive. The slide that's not there, get out and chalk your wheels. Establish your connection to the source. Notice what step is missing here that was on the previous slides from booster tank.
Tank pump.
Yeah, your tank to pump valve. We're not using that. We're going straight to a pressurized source. Make your connections. Use adapters as needed. Ensure the intake valve is in a closed position. Pressurize the line. Open the bleeder. Slowly open the valve. All right. Note your intake pressure to ensure that the source is supplying enough water to produce an effective fire stream. I didn't have George proofread my slides, apparently. So before we open any discharge line, we need to make sure that the hydrant is sufficient to produce the water that we need without using the booster tank. Open your discharge, monitor residual pressure. Your intake pressure should never be allowed to dip below 20. The only difference between this and pumping off your booster tank is that you never open your tank to pump valve, and it's much less complicated because I don't already have a line going, so I can actually establish my intake before I open a line, and so then it's just easier. If you have the ability to do that, that's great, but if you're on a fire scene, you almost always are gonna start with your booster tank, because we wanna get water to the fire as fast as possible, right? Alright, so static. I put this note in here. There's a lot of safety, accessibility, and operational considerations to be taken into account during drafting operations. You've got to consider your terrain. You've got to consider the hardness of the ground. You've got to consider, can I get my truck close enough to the thing? Do I have enough hard suction hose? Is the pond too dirty? Does it have too many rocks in it? On and on and on. All considerations you have to take before you draft. That's a different class. We're not talking about that in this class. We're just talking about the mechanical processes, okay? But I just wanted to make sure that we understand you cannot just pull up to any body of water and pull water out of it. I know everybody already knows that, but for this class, we will operate under the assumption that all of these considerations have been made prior to our arrival. For the purposes of this class, we'll be operating from a portable drafting tank that will already be set up, okay? So connecting to the source. First thing we're going to do is ensure that a strainer is in place prior to placing the hard suction hose into the water. That's one type of strainer. What's that called? Low level strainer. That's the name of that. Remember that. Low level strainer. What's that one called? It's called a barrel strainer. Yeah. Particularly remember the name of that one, because that's the one we use. Low level strainer. Make sure strainers, do not just drop your hard suction hose into a body of water without a strainer and established draft. I will have to use a lot of self-control to not punch you in the throat. If I've seen, I won't punch you in the throat, but I will take a lot of self-control for me not to. Don't do it. Always put a strainer on. Place the end of the hard suction hose into the drafting tank with the strainer on it, and then hook the hard suction hose to the main intake valve. Now, I'll tell you, this is the first place I've ever worked that has Stort's hard intake connection, or hard suction connections. I asked you guys, do they work? You guys say they do, and I've seen it because we pumped with the new pumper. It's hard for me to believe that they get a good enough seal, but they do. So, because I come from the day where you thread that sucker on, and you not just that, you take a hammer and you knock the crap out of that sucker until it's tight. But good gaskets make a big difference, don't they? So, all right, priming the pump. So we've made our connections. We've got the one end in the water, one end on the intake. Next step, activate the primer. On this truck, on both of our pumpers, or our engine and our pumper, the primer valve is a push button air actuated primer. I know the one on 71 sticking, I have a new one for it in my office, so as soon as we get into the new truck,
It's real bad today.
Yeah.
well, it'll be on my agenda, we'll replace it, and then we'll take that one and clean it up and have it for spare, because that's all it is. It's got
I figured it was
gravel dust and stuff in it.
I got a question for you.
Yes, sir.
There's a couple fill in the blanks here that I don't have the answers for.
Yeah.
Barrel strainer needs a minimum of blank.
Oh, yes, thank you. Barrel strainer needs a minimum of 2 feet or 24 inches of clearance. I forgot to mention that.
And then the
Low level strainer needs 4 inches. They say 2 inches. The book says 2 inches, I say 4 inches. Okay? This is my class, so we're going with 4 inches. 4 inches, 24 inches. Thank you. Anytime that happens, stop me, because I'm not reading off my lesson plan like I should be. Alright, so we've made our connection, we activate our primer. While the primer is still activated, slowly open the intake valve. This is one reason I like a manual intake valve too, over push button intake
Because
valve.
of garbage.
Yeah, so primer, slowly open the intake valve. If you do that, like that's, a lot of people say open the intake valve, then the primer, which If you have water in the pump, probably will work. If you don't have any water in the pump, like let's say it's winter time, we're running around with drain pumps,
You open pump the tank first,
your tank to pump.
pump the tank.
Oh yeah, to push water into the tank so you have water going somewhere. But if you push your primer, if you hold your primer button and then open your intake, as that intake's opening, it's gonna take less pressure to prime the pump, is essentially the thought behind that. And that's the way I've always done it, it always works. If you get these out of order and it works, good on you. And I'm telling you, this pump out here, this new one, you don't even have to hit the primer. It just primes itself. But don't take that for granted because it may not always be like that.
Until the seal starts to leak.
Yeah. Do not continue to activate the primer for longer than 30 consecutive seconds. Especially the old style primers, you'll burn them up. I've actually seen multiple times primer pumps catching on fire, and like we had to stop and get an extinguisher and put it out, and then the class was done for the day. So like you can burn your primer up. If you're not able to establish draft after 30 seconds of primer activation, check your fittings and connections for tightness and gasket condition. That's probably your problem. We're not going to get into a ton of troubleshooting because it's a basic pump operation class. All right, so if you're not already on a booster tank, establish your draft. It might be helpful to slightly open the tank fill valve in order to maintain prime. Your pump to tank valve. If you're already pumping from the booster tank, slowly close the tank to pump valve after the intake is open and after draft is established, and that should also say after you're flowing water somewhere. Okay. Continue to flow water from a discharge at all times. Establish a dump line. Okay, a dump line is just a line off a discharge that's continuously flowing water.
Can we get that bracket?
Is there a bracket for it?
There's just, yeah, a bracket that slides down and then
Oh.
you can screw.
Onto the side of the porta tank?
Yeah.
I'll look into it.
Like a little 45.
Yeah, I'll look into it.
Had them on both sides.
Okay. So anyway, yeah, that's good, and usually you deploy your dump line back into the tank, and that way you're not just wasting water out to wherever.
We do have the jet siphon option too.
Yeah, you got the jet siphon on the open.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Do the same thing.
Yeah, so the idea is just to always have water moving, because we're using like I said at the beginning, we're using a siphon effect, basically, to keep pressure going. So if we lose the siphon effect, we could potentially lose draft. So partially open the discharge for the hand line, the dump line, leave the discharge open until the operation period is complete. Your dump line, once it's established, it's always going. Even, your fire's out, your investigator's there, you're still on scene, whatever, your dump line's still going until you're shutting down. Refilling the booster tank. It's important to refill the booster tank at the first available moment. If the pump loses prime, you'll need to transition back to your booster tank and give interior crews an opportunity to put themselves in a safe position. This happens sometimes. Just know that if you're in a draft situation and for some reason you see your discharge pressure drop all of a sudden, you've lost draft. Who knows why at that point? The way to keep your crew safe is to open your tank to pump valve, just right then. It fixes it automatically. Remember though, you're probably in RPM mode, so just be aware of your discharge pressures when you do that, because you could spike your pressures a little bit. And I'm not saying jerk it open, don't ever jerk any valve open, just open it slowly. But that's just, when I'm establishing draft, if I already have a line going, I keep my hand on the tank to pump valve while I'm opening everything else, because I don't want to, if I've got people operating inside, I don't want them to lose water even for a moment. So like if I see, something's going wrong with my draft and I'm not picking it up, I just open that tank to pump, and then I do my troubleshooting and then start it all over, So I'm not sure how I would have a crew already operating with my tank to pump not open already, unless I'd already shut it because I thought I had draft. That's where it usually happens. You think you have draft, you shut it, and then your pressure's starting to drop. Just open it back up. All right. go through a few more slides and then we'll take one break. We're getting close to the end. Now we're getting into the fun stuff. So PSI versus GPM. This is one of a foundational principle that I think sometimes pump operators don't take the time to understand. Like, I know when I was, even after I've been in the fire service for years, I really didn't understand the relationship between PSI and GPM, or what the difference was, or what I was trying to achieve. So I want to give you kind of a basic idea of the differences, and as a pump operator, what they mean. All right? So your GPM is gallons per minute. Think flow, or we call it flow. Think the volume of water coming out the end of the nozzle. That's your GPM, and operationally speaking. Okay? That's what we're trying to achieve. That's what makes an effective fire stream, like Brian said at the beginning of class. GPM makes an effective fire stream. So we refer to it as flow. Think of the volume of water coming out the end of the nozzle. More flow equals more steam conversion equals more heat dissipation. This is what puts the fire out. More PSI, unless it is increasing flow, does not do anything to the fire. They used to think that you could essentially blow the fire out with pressure. They used to think you could move the fire with pressure. You can't. You cannot push fire with water. You can move air pathways with water, which can then encourage the fire to move, but you can't push. That's another class. Anyway, see, this is a problem. I get nerded out on this stuff, but flow is the important thing. More flow equals more steam conversion equals more heat dissipation. This is what puts the fire out. PSI is pounds per square inch. We refer to it as pressure, and think of it as the force behind the flow. More PSI can generate more GPM to a point, but the relationship is complicated because there's all kinds of external things that affect GPM. The size of your hose, the length of your hose, the type of nozzle you're using, the amount of water you have. All of that stuff affects PSI and GPM, but in the end it affects GPM. There is no, and it's not like I increase my PSI by 2 pounds, I increase my GPM by 0.25. It's just not, it doesn't work that way. The scale moves. It's a curved scale. So, I can increase my PSI to a point and increase GPM, but at a point, I'm going to get a certain amount of GPM, and that's all I'm going to get out of a given nozzle, no matter what. So, on a fog nozzle, for instance, if I have optimum PSI that produces the set amount of GPM that nozzle can produce, I cannot produce any more GPM by increasing the pressure. But what I can produce is more nozzle reaction. So I can produce all kinds of nozzle reaction and not get any more PSI or GPM out of that nozzle. So that's why it's important to know what you're trying to achieve at the end of the nozzle from the pump. Because you can crank up the pressure until their feet come off the ground, and the only thing you're accomplishing is making their feet come off the ground. You're not getting any more water out of the end of that hose. Does that make sense? But generally speaking, PSI generates GPM because we apply pressure to the water wants to flow. All right? Okay, so let's take lunch. We'll come back at 1 o'clock. We'll have probably 20 to 30 more minutes of slides, and then we'll go out and knock the skills out, and we'll be done. Question before we do that. When we get done with the slides, you want to go out and do the practicals and then come back in and take the classroom evaluation? Or do you want to take the classroom evaluation and then go out and do the practicals?
Do the test first.
Okay.
It's an evaluation, sir.
Yeah. So, all right. Very good.
So, you have this cheat sheet here.
Yeah.
And reconnect with the plug. However, you don't have 175.
Oh, wow. You have a break.
Yeah.
It's just like,
And it's the same.
let me surprised.
Supplies.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily use this when I made this.
This weekend,
I'm just going off of what I know to be realistic.
So what would be your straight, like this?
Okay, so, yeah, so nozzle pressure
You
is,
come around, grab them with the forearm.
sorry.
The thing is, the guy was way taller.
Okay, on
So I was trying to
our
grab-
automatic faucet
Yeah, it was
nozzles,
just-
our
I could not
our
figure out.
nozzle pressure
I was-
is one
He will
hundred.
do it a lot easier on Daniel once I figure it out.
Hoping 175.
He's
That 175 GPM,
Yeah,
yeah,
250.
Yeah.
200.
But no,
Our crossfits are 200,
I was
right?
kind of I could not figure out that.
Yeah.
I was like, dude,
Yeah, yeah.
there's no.
So that's why I said, that's where I
So,
got the 180
you're
PSI.
hooking them-
I'm figuring 80 pounds of friction
Yeah.
loss.
So it was like,
Which,
you,
truth be
it
told,
was like you threw a
I never pumped that much.
So, I'm talking
So-
about these pressures.
straight
This is really
up.
deep.
Yeah, so those are,
You grab the
like, to
arm,
get
and then
the
you just
pressures
up.
you're supposed to be getting at the nozzle,
Yeah,
those
yeah.
are the pressures.
See,
you
I was
get.
kind of, this guy was up here, and I'm like,
Well, now I got
Yeah. so I'm just grabbing him like with his hand.
Right.
He's like, grab
But,
my
yeah,
forearm.
the-
But I mean, still, like, okay, so on your fog
Yeah.
nozzle,
I'm trying to pull him
Uh,
down. I can't.
Cause you're supposed to have at least 100 at the nozzle for it.
so in our next slides actually get into this, but, so this nozzle is set to pump 125 GPM at 100 PSI, okay?
So that's optimal.
So that's the best, you cannot get much more than 125 PSI, GPM out of this nozzle. You can pump it at 150 nozzle pressure,
You're just wasting 50.
you're just getting more nozzle reaction.
You're just pissing somebody off.
Yeah, and, I thought, isn't our other fog nozzle 175 and 100? I thought we had a 175 and 100, so that's why I made that chart that way, but, so you want 120, or 100 PSI at the nozzle, so you have to account for friction loss to get 100 PSI at the nozzle. So in order to get 100 PSI, I gotta account for all the friction loss to get 100 out, and then that'll give me 125, and this nozzle, it won't change, no matter the hose.
Right.
Or
So
anything.
you actually did the math, the equations to get that.
Yes, well, I did not do equations, I did basic estimate methodology, and we'll talk about that in the next slides.
Technically, like if you go up second story, you gotta put an elevation.
Well, yeah,
last-
no,
all that stuff.
That's all coming up,
Yeah.
but this chart is actually theoretical math calculations. This chart is based on other methods, like, 10 PSI per 50 foot of 1 3/4, which is not a mathematical, because here's the situation is, your first 50 feet, you're actually only losing like 8 PSI.
Yeah, 'cause
Your
it's
second
incremental.
50 feet, and it's gonna, the longer your lay is, the more you're gonna lose, but on a 200-foot lay, you can estimate 40 PSI,
So this is close.
should be
It's
close,
within a window.
yes. That's all that was, is like, I wanted
So
to
I'm like
get,
trying to figure out, how the fuck did
those tables don't really go together.
They're on the same piece of paper.
I know, because I wanted to save laminate. So,
This is just two smooth bores.
yes,
Yes. So
yeah,
with like some of the new hoses out there that would have like the lower friction loss hose, and then like we got the low pressure nozzles and stuff
Yeah.
like that. So the trend is we don't have to pump as much PSI because we're getting better equipment.
yeah.
But old school, like we had to pump like 130, 150 to get the 100 at the nozzle.
Yeah, and we don't have low friction hose yet,
No.
so
You can't just dump a bunch of
we're
crap
still
on it.
using the old numbers.